The early morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine tarmac of Charleston International Airport's private terminal. Dr. Sarah Thompson pulled up to the exclusive entrance in her Tesla Model S, her heart beating steadily despite the urgency of her upcoming flight. At 42 years old, she had earned every bit of her success as one of the Southeast's most respected neurosurgeons, yet mornings like these still filled her with purpose. She checked her phone one more time, reading the message about her young patient in Boston. 7-year-old Emily needed emergency surgery, and Sarah was one of the few surgeons qualified to perform the complex procedure. Time was precious, which was why she had chartered the private jet instead of waiting for the next commercial flight. The terminal's glass doors reflected her image as she approached. A tall woman in a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, her natural hair styled professionally, and her designer briefcase containing both her medical documents and the charter flight paperwork. Her heels clicked against the polished floor with each confident step, a rhythm she had grown accustomed to during her 15 years of practicing medicine. Sarah noticed the usual morning activities around the private terminal. A couple of pilots chatted near the coffee station, their crisp uniforms and easy smiles suggesting another routine day. A wealthy family with Louis Vuitton luggage was being escorted through security, their vacation excitement evident in their voices. The smell of fresh coffee and leather seats filled the air, mixing with the subtle scent of jet fuel that always lingered in these exclusive spaces. As she approached the security checkpoint, Sarah mentally reviewed her schedule. The flight to Boston would take about 2 hours. Her surgical team there was already prepping, and she would head straight to Massachusetts General Hospital upon landing. The surgery was scheduled for early afternoon, giving her plenty of time to review the latest scans and meet with Emily's parents. The weight of her medical license and board certifications in her briefcase felt reassuring. After performing hundreds of successful surgeries, Sarah had learned to carry herself with quiet confidence. Her colleagues often joked that she could probably do brain surgery in her sleep, though she always reminded them that every patient deserved her complete attention and best effort. She pulled out her charter flight documentation and medical credentials, arranging them neatly in her hands. The morning light streaming through the terminal's tall windows caught the gold embossing on her medical license and the platinum card from the charter company marking her as a VIP client. Having used the same terminal several times before for emergency cases, Sarah expected the usual efficient and professional service. What she didn't expect was the security guard who was now watching her approach. James Mitchell stood at his post, his eyes narrowing as she walked closer. Despite her professional appearance and the documents clearly visible in her hands, something in his expression suggested this wouldn't be the smooth check-in she had grown accustomed to. Sarah took a deep breath, maintaining her usual calm demeanor. Years of handling high-pressure situations in the operating room had taught her to stay composed under any circumstances. She thought briefly of young Emily waiting in Boston, unaware that her surgeon was about to face an unexpected challenge before even boarding the plane. The terminal's air conditioning hummed softly in the background as she reached the security desk. Other travelers continued their morning routines around them, a businessman sipping his coffee while reading the Wall Street Journal, a flight attendant checking her schedule, a maintenance worker quietly mopping the floors. None of them realized they were about to witness something that would change not only their morning, but potentially the way this entire charter company operated. Sarah placed her documents on the counter, her movements deliberate and professional. The next few moments would test her patience in ways that 15 years of medical practice hadn't prepared her for. But like every challenge she had faced in her career, she would handle it with the grace and dignity that had become her trademark. Little did anyone in that terminal know that this ordinary Tuesday morning was about to become anything but ordinary. Security guard James Mitchell stood behind his desk, his fingers drumming against the polished surface. He had worked at the private terminal for 3 years, and in his mind, he knew exactly what type of people belonged here. The woman approaching his desk didn't fit his narrow view of a private jet passenger, despite her expensive suit and professional demeanor. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice carrying a tone that suggested the opposite of helpfulness. He didn't bother to look at the documents Dr. Thompson had placed on the counter. Instead, his eyes darted to the exit, as if suggesting where she should go. Dr. Thompson spoke clearly and professionally. "Good morning. I'm Dr. Sarah Thompson. I have a chartered flight to Boston scheduled for 8:30 a.m. She slid her documentation forward, including her charter company VIP card that gleamed under the terminal's lights. Mitchell crossed his arms and leaned back. Ma'am, this is the private terminal. I think you might be confused. The main terminal is about half a mile that way. He pointed toward the regular airport entrance, speaking slowly as if talking to a child. A few feet away, other travelers began to notice the interaction. A businessman lowered his newspaper, watching over its edge. Two pilots stopped their conversation, coffee cups frozen halfway to their lips. The friendly morning atmosphere in the terminal started to turn tense. I'm not confused, Dr. Thompson replied calmly, though she felt her heart rate increasing slightly. I have all my documentation right here. I'm a neurosurgeon heading to Boston for an emergency surgery. The charter company arranged everything yesterday evening. Mitchell picked up her documents with 2 fingers, as if they might bite him. He made a show of flipping through them carelessly, barely glancing at the official letterhead and credentials. These could be anything, he said dismissively. Look, I've worked here long enough to know who usually comes through these doors. Just then, a wealthy white couple walked up to the security desk. Without even checking their papers, Mitchell smiled broadly and waved them through. Good morning, folks. Have a wonderful flight. The contrast in treatment was painfully obvious to everyone watching. Dr. Thompson took another deep breath, thinking of her patient in Boston. Every minute of delay meant precious time wasted. Sir, I understand you're doing your job, but I am a legitimate passenger. Please check with the charter company if you have concerns. Instead of reaching for his phone to verify her story, Mitchell pressed a button under his desk. Security to the main desk, he announced into his radio. We have a situation here. His emphasis on the word situation made several onlookers shake their heads in disbelief. More people had gathered around now. A young flight attendant was recording the scene on her phone, her hands shaking slightly with anger. An elderly gentleman in a business suit stepped forward as if to intervene, but Dr. Thompson caught his eye and subtly shook her head. She would handle this her way. Mr. Mitchell, she said, reading his name tag. I've used this terminal 6 times in the past year for emergency medical flights. I'm sure if you check your records. Records can be faked, he interrupted, his voice getting louder. This is a secure facility. We can't just let anyone walk in claiming to be a doctor. The irony of his words hung in the air, given how he had just let others pass without any verification. 2 security guards appeared, responding to Mitchell's call. They approached cautiously, sensing something wasn't right about the situation. One of them, an older man named Roberts, recognized Dr. Thompson from her previous flights but remained silent, caught between professionalism and personal discomfort. The terminal had grown eerily quiet. The only sounds were the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the distant roar of jet engines. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, creating long shadows that seemed to divide the space between those watching and those involved. Dr. Thompson stood perfectly still, her posture straight and dignified. She had faced discrimination before, but never had it threatened to interfere with her ability to save a life. As she contemplated her next move, she thought of young Emily waiting in Boston, her parents probably pacing the hospital halls. She would handle this situation, but she would do it in a way that might actually create change. The confrontation was about to take an unexpected turn, and everyone in the terminal knew they were witnessing something significant. The terminal's atmosphere grew heavier with each passing moment. The 2 security guards flanked Mitchell's desk, their expressions a mix of uncertainty and discomfort. Dr. Thompson remained steady, her medical credentials still laid out on the counter like evidence in a trial no one had planned for. She's refusing to leave, Mitchell announced to the security guards, loud enough for everyone to hear. His voice carried a false authority that made several onlookers wince. Says she has a private flight. We all know that's unlikely. The last words slipped out with unmistakable prejudice. The younger security guard, whose name tag read Anderson, shifted uncomfortably. Fresh to the job, he had never faced a situation like this. The older guard, Roberts, knew better. He had seen Dr. Thompson multiple times before, but remained frozen in indecision, torn between duty and decency. More phones appeared among the growing crowd. A young woman in business attire whispered to her colleague, "Is this really happening in 2024? Their phones recorded steadily, capturing every word, every gesture, every moment of this unfolding scene. Dr. Thompson glanced at her watch. 8:15 a.m. Time was becoming critical. She thought of her surgical team in Boston, already preparing the operating room. Every minute lost here meant delayed care for a child who desperately needed help. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying the same calm authority she used in the operating room, "I need to speak with your supervisor immediately." She reached for her phone, preparing to call the charter company herself. Mitchell's face reddened. "Put that phone away," he snapped, his composure cracking. "This is a secure area. No phones allowed at the security checkpoint." Yet just feet away, other passengers freely used their devices, its selective enforcement glaringly obvious. The charter company's morning staff had begun arriving for their shifts. A young receptionist named Jenny walked in, immediately recognizing Dr. Thompson from previous flights. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene. She turned quickly, rushing back through the staff door, presumably to alert management. "I've had enough of this," Mitchell declared, reaching for his radio again. "I'm calling the police. We have an unauthorized person refusing to leave the premises." His hand shook slightly as he reached for the radio, perhaps finally realizing the gravity of his actions. The older guard, Roberts, finally found his voice. "James, maybe we should." "Don't interfere, Roberts," Mitchell cut him off. "I know what I'm doing." But the tremor in his voice suggested otherwise. Dr. Thompson remained still, her calm exterior masking her internal calculations. As a neurosurgeon, she had learned to stay composed during the most intense situations. This was different from a complicated surgery, but she approached it with the same methodical thinking. The crowd had grown larger. Pilots, passengers, and airport staff formed a loose circle around the security desk. Some whispered among themselves, others recorded silently, and a few seemed ready to intervene. The terminal's usual morning bustle had completely stopped, all attention focused on this point of conflict. A distinguished-looking man in a pilot's uniform stepped forward. "I've flown Dr. Thompson before," he stated firmly. "She's one of our regular charter passengers." But Mitchell waved him away dismissively, too committed to his position to accept any evidence that contradicted his assumptions. Dr. Thompson noticed a small group of staff members huddled near the charter company's office door, speaking urgently into phones. Help was coming, but time was still ticking away. Her patient in Boston couldn't afford much more delay. She pulled out her phone again, this time deliberately and slowly. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I'm going to make 2 calls. One to the charter company's corporate office and one to my surgical team in Boston. While I do this, I suggest you think carefully about your next actions." The terminal fell completely silent. Even the usual airport announcements seemed to have paused, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The morning sun had risen higher, its rays now streaming directly through the terminal's windows, illuminating the scene like a spotlight on a stage. Mitchell's face showed the first signs of doubt, but pride kept him from backing down. The situation had escalated far beyond a simple security check, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something that would have consequences far beyond this morning. Just as the tension in the terminal reached its peak, the double doors behind the security desk burst open. Thomas Baker, the charter company's regional manager, rushed out with Jenny, the receptionist, close behind. His face showed clear alarm as he took in the scene before him. "Dr. Thompson," he called out, slightly out of breath from running. "I just got the call. What in the world is going on here?" He looked at Mitchell, then back at Dr. Thompson, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to horror in quick succession. Mitchell straightened up, suddenly less sure of himself. "Sir, I was just following security protocols. This woman claims." "This woman," Thomas interrupted sharply, "is Dr. Sarah Thompson, one of our most valued clients. She's flown with us at least 20 times in the past 2 years. He turned to Dr. Thompson, his face red with embarrassment. "Doctor, I cannot begin to apologize enough for this situation." The crowd watching the scene murmured. Several phones were still recording, capturing every word. Mitchell's face had lost its color, his earlier confidence replaced by growing realization. Thomas pulled out a tablet from his briefcase and quickly pulled up Dr. Thompson's client profile. He turned the screen toward Mitchell, showing a detailed history of flights, complete with photos and credentials. "Dr. Thompson is a leading neurosurgeon," Thomas continued, his voice carrying across the now silent terminal. She regularly uses our services for emergency medical flights. In fact, she's scheduled for an urgent flight to Boston right now for a critical pediatric case. Jenny stepped forward with a file in her hands. I have all of Dr. Thompson's pre-approved security clearances right here, she said, spreading the documents on the counter. These are renewed every 6 months. She has the highest level of clearance possible for our charter clients. Mitchell stared at the documents, then at his supervisor, then at Dr. Thompson. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The 2 security guards who had backed him up earlier stepped away, trying to distance themselves from the situation. An older woman in the crowd spoke up. She tried to show him her credentials, but he wouldn't even look at them. Others nodded in agreement, and more voices joined in, describing what they had witnessed. Thomas's face grew even more concerned as he listened to the observers. He turned to Dr. Thompson, who maintained her composed demeanor despite everything that had happened. Dr. Thompson, your flight crew is ready and waiting. They've already started the pre-flight checks. Thomas gestured toward the terminal gates. Please, let me escort you personally. We'll deal with this situation immediately. But Dr. Thompson raised her hand gently, stopping him mid-gesture. The same steady hands that had performed countless delicate surgeries now commanded the attention of everyone in the terminal. She had something to say first. Mitchell stood frozen behind his desk, watching as his entire world seemed to crumble around him. The security badge on his chest, which had given him such a sense of power just minutes ago, now felt heavy with the weight of his actions. The morning sun had fully risen now, streaming through the terminal's windows and illuminating dust particles in the air, making them dance like tiny stars. The scene had transformed from a confrontation into something else, a moment of truth that would change more than just one morning at a private terminal. Dr. Thompson looked at her watch one more time. Despite the delay, she knew she could still make it to Boston in time for the surgery. But first, she would turn this moment of discrimination into something meaningful. Her response would not only address Mitchell's actions, but would also challenge the charter company to do better. The terminal fell completely silent, waiting for her words. Even the distant sound of jet engines seemed to quiet down, as if nature itself wanted to hear what this remarkable woman would say next. Thomas Baker stood nervously, knowing that how the company handled the next few minutes would have lasting consequences. The phones kept recording, ready to capture a moment that would soon become much bigger than anyone in that terminal could imagine. The private terminal fell silent as Dr. Thompson looked at the young boy in the Boston Children's Hospital cap, then at Mitchell, and finally at the crowd of onlookers. Her response in the next few moments would define more than just this morning's events. First, she began, her voice clear and steady, I want to thank everyone who spoke up and recorded what happened here today. She smiled gently at the people holding phones. But now, I need to share something important. Mitchell stood uncomfortably behind his desk, unable to meet her eyes. Mark Stevens, the COO, nodded encouragingly for her to continue. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow across the terminal. Every day in my operating room, Dr. Thompson continued, I work with people of all backgrounds. When someone is on my operating table, their life is in my hands. Do you know what I see when I look at their brain? She paused, letting the question hang in the air. The young boy's mother wiped tears from her eyes, holding her son close. The crowd leaned in, phones still recording every word. I see a miracle of human life. I don't see race, religion, or social status. I see a person who needs help, a family waiting for good news, a future that needs protecting. Her voice remained calm but carried strength that filled the room. She turned to face Mitchell directly. Mr. Mitchell, when you stopped me this morning, you didn't just delay a doctor. You risked a child's life because of assumptions you made based on how I look. Mitchell's face flushed with shame. Some people in the crowd nodded, while others looked down, perhaps recognizing similar prejudices in themselves. But I'm not angry. Dr. Thompson continued, surprising everyone. Anger doesn't solve problems. In surgery, when something unexpected happens, we don't panic or get angry. We stay calm and fix the problem. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small photo. This is Jason, a patient I operated on last month. He was scared when he first saw me, told his parents he thought doctors were supposed to look different. By the time he left the hospital, he said he wanted to be just like me when he grew up. The young boy with the Boston cap spoke up. Can my sister meet you after the surgery, too? Dr. Thompson smiled warmly. Of course you can. And you know what? Your sister is going to be just fine. The boy's mother burst into fresh tears, but this time they were tears of hope. Turning back to Mitchell and the charter company officials, Dr. Thompson's expression became serious again. What happened here today isn't just about me. It's about every person who's been judged before being heard. Every professional who's been questioned despite their credentials. Every dream that's been delayed by prejudice. Mark Stevens stepped forward. Dr. Thompson, I assure you, there will be consequences. She raised her hand gently, stopping him. Instead of consequences, I want changes. Real changes. She looked around the terminal. Train your staff better. Create clear procedures that are applied equally to everyone. Use this incident to teach, not punish. Mitchell, who had been silent, finally spoke. His voice was barely a whisper. I'm sorry, Dr. Thompson. I was wrong. Thank you, Mr. Mitchell, she replied with dignity. That's a good start. Now, if everyone will excuse me, I have a young patient waiting in Boston who needs my help. As she gathered her belongings, the crowd spontaneously began to applaud. The sound echoed through the terminal, growing louder as more people joined in. Even some of the other pilots and flight crew members stepped out of their areas to show their respect. The young boy tugged at her sleeve. Dr. Thompson, can I tell my sister that a superhero is coming to help her? She knelt down to his level one more time. Tell her that someone who cares very much is coming to help. Sometimes that's even better than a superhero. As she walked toward her gate, escorted by Mark Stevens, the applause continued. She had transformed a moment of discrimination into a lesson in dignity, and everyone present knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. The atmosphere in the terminal changed completely after Dr. Thompson's words. People who had been strangers just moments ago began talking to each other, sharing their thoughts about what they had just witnessed. The morning sun now filled the space with warm light, as if nature itself approved of how things had turned out. Mark Stevens, the COO, walked with purpose to the security desk where Mitchell stood. James, come with me, he said firmly but not unkindly. We need to talk. Mitchell nodded silently, following his boss toward the offices. His shoulders drooped, but there was something different in his expression now, not just shame, but the beginning of understanding. Jenny, the young receptionist, was already on her phone. Yes, corporate needs to see all the footage right away. She spoke into her cell phone. This isn't just about one incident. This is going to change how we do things. Around her, several passengers who had recorded the scene nodded and began sending their videos to the email address she shared. The elderly businessman who had wanted to intervene earlier approached the security guards who had backed up Mitchell. You know, he said thoughtfully, in my 40 years of flying private, I've seen a lot of discrimination, but I've never seen someone handle it with such grace. The guards looked uncomfortable but listened as he continued. Maybe it's time for all of us to learn from this. Near the coffee station, two pilots were in deep conversation. Remember last month when we questioned that female pilot's credentials? One whispered to the other. Maybe we need to think about our own biases too. His colleague nodded slowly, stirring his coffee with unusual focus. The young boy who would be waiting for his sister's surgery had pulled out a notebook. His mother watched with curiosity as he wrote carefully in large letters. Today I met a real hero. She doesn't wear a cape, but she saves lives with her hands and her heart. Thomas Baker, the regional manager, was already on the phone with the corporate office. Yes, sir, I think we need to completely revamp our training program. Dr. Thompson showed us there's a better way to handle these situations. No, sir, not just sensitivity training. We need real change. A group of regular charter customers had gathered near the window, watching Dr. Thompson's plane prepare for takeoff. You know, said a woman in a business suit, I'm going to request her as my surgeon if I ever need one. That kind of compassion combined with skill, that's rare. Social media was already buzzing. Those who had recorded the scene were sharing it with thoughtful captions. This is how you handle discrimination with dignity. Watch this doctor turn prejudice into a teaching moment. The perfect response to bias. Grace under pressure. The security team's supervisor arrived, having been called in early. He looked around at his staff, noting how some couldn't meet his eyes. Starting tomorrow, he announced, we're going to do things differently. Every passenger deserves respect. Every credential gets checked properly. No exceptions, no assumptions. In the charter company's office, Jenny was creating a new file labeled Thompson Protocol. Inside, she began typing, "Guidelines for equal treatment of all passengers." She paused, then added, "Inspired by Dr. Sarah Thompson's response to discrimination." Outside on the tarmac, Dr. Thompson's pilot finished his pre-flight checks with extra care. "We'll get you there fast and safe, Doctor," he promised as she boarded. "That little girl in Boston is lucky to have you coming." Dr. Thompson smiled warmly, knowing that today she had performed 2 types of healing, one for the terminal's culture, and soon, one for her patient. Back in the terminal, the young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, when I grow up, I want to be like Dr. Thompson." His mother hugged him close. "Which part, honey? The doctor part?" The boy shook his head. "All of it. The brave part, the kind part, the helping people part." As the jet engine started up, people gathered at the windows to watch. The plane would carry Dr. Thompson to Boston to save a life, but she had already changed many lives right here in Charleston. The impact of her response would ripple out far beyond this morning, touching hearts and minds in ways that would last far longer than any flight. 1 week after the incident at Charleston International Airport's private terminal, the changes were already visible. New signs hung in the terminal reading "Welcome all" and "Respect first." The security desk where Mitchell had stood now had 2 officers working together, checking credentials thoroughly but politely for every passenger. Mark Stevens sat in his office, reviewing the final report of the investigation. On his desk lay a stack of letters, hundreds of them, from people who had watched the viral video of Dr. Thompson's response. The incident had gotten over 5 million views across social media platforms. "Come in," he called, hearing a knock at his door. James Mitchell entered, looking different from the man who had caused such trouble a week ago. The arrogance was gone from his stance, replaced by something more thoughtful. "Sir," Mitchell began, his voice quiet but steady, "I've completed the first week of the new training program." He placed a certificate on the desk, along with a handwritten letter. "And I've written something I'd like to send to Dr. Thompson, if you think it's appropriate." Mark picked up the letter and read it carefully. Mitchell had written about his background, his prejudices, and how Dr. Thompson's response had opened his eyes. He ended with a sincere apology and a promise to change. "This is good, James," Mark said, looking up. "But actions speak louder than words. How was the training?" Mitchell sat straighter in his chair. "Life-changing, sir. The diversity consultant you brought in. She helped me understand things I'd never even thought about before. And working with Officer Roberts this week, learning from his experience," he paused. "I got a lot to learn, but I'm committed to doing better." Meanwhile, in Boston, Dr. Thompson was making her rounds at Massachusetts General Hospital. Little Emily, the 7-year-old patient she had rushed to save, was recovering beautifully from her surgery. The girl's room was filled with get-well cards, and on her bedside table sat a special photo. "Look, Dr. Thompson," Emily called out as the doctor entered. She pointed to the photo, which showed her with her brother in the private terminal. "Mom says you helped me before you even got to the hospital. She says you showed people how to be brave and kind at the same time." Dr. Thompson smiled, checking Emily's vital signs. The monitors showed strong, steady readings. "The best medicine," she told Emily, "is when we help each other be better people." Back in Charleston, the charter company had just finished installing a new computer system. Every passenger's credentials were now scanned and verified electronically, eliminating the possibility of biased treatment. Jenny, who had been promoted to Customer Relations Manager, was training staff on the new system. "Remember," she told the group of employees, "the Thompson Protocol isn't just about checking papers. It's about treating everyone with dignity." The staff nodded, many of them having watched the viral video dozens of times. In the terminal's break room, Officer Roberts was mentoring a group of new security staff. "What Dr. Thompson taught us," he explained, "is that security and respect can go hand in hand. We can do our jobs well without losing our humanity." The young boy who had witnessed everything, Tommy, had started a project at his school called Heroes Among Us. His first presentation was about Dr. Thompson, complete with pictures and quotes from that morning. His teacher had been so impressed that she'd invited other students to share stories of everyday heroes they knew. Mark Stevens picked up his phone, reading a new message. The charter company's board had just approved a major new initiative, a scholarship program for minority students interested in becoming pilots or aviation professionals. They had named it the Thompson Scholarship for Excellence and Equality. Outside the terminal, a new plaque had been installed. It read, "Every journey begins with respect. Every passenger deserves dignity." Below these words was the date of the incident, not as a reminder of discrimination, but as a marker of when things began to change. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the terminal floor, a new group of passengers moved through security. Each one received the same professional, respectful treatment. The changes weren't perfect yet, but they were real and growing stronger each day. In Boston, Emily was taking her first steps post-surgery, holding Dr. Thompson's hand. Both of them were smiling, proof that healing comes in many forms, and that sometimes the best response to darkness is to shine even brighter. 1 month had passed since that memorable morning at Charleston International Airport's private terminal. The story of Dr. Thompson's response to discrimination had traveled far beyond the terminal's walls, creating waves of change that nobody had expected. In her office at the hospital, Dr. Thompson sat reading emails from around the country. Medical students wrote about how her story inspired them to pursue their dreams despite facing prejudice. Airport staff from different cities shared how they had changed their training programs. Parents thanked her for showing their children what real strength looked like. "Dr. Thompson," her assistant called from the doorway, "the film crew from the National News Channel is here. They want to do the interview about the Thompson Protocol." She smiled, remembering how a single morning had turned into a movement. The Thompson Protocol had become famous in the aviation industry, adopted by airports and airlines across the country. It wasn't just about checking credentials. It was about treating everyone with equal respect and dignity. At the Charleston terminal, James Mitchell stood at his security desk, but everything was different now. His new partner was Officer Maria Rodriguez, and together they greeted each passenger with the same professional courtesy. The security cameras above them weren't just for watching suspicious activity anymore. They were used in training sessions to show excellent customer service. "Good morning, Dr. Roberts," Mitchell said warmly to an African-American doctor approaching his desk. A year ago, he might have questioned her presence. Now, he efficiently checked her credentials while engaging in friendly conversation about her medical mission trip. In Boston, little Emily had made a full recovery. Her family had traveled back to Charleston to visit Dr. Thompson, but this time through the main terminal. Emily's brother Tommy proudly wore his new T-shirt, which read, "Future Doctor," a gift from Dr. Thompson herself. The charter company's boardroom buzzed with excitement. Mark Stevens presented the latest figures. Complaints about discrimination had dropped to zero, customer satisfaction was at an all-time high, and their new training program was being licensed to other companies. "The Thompson Scholarship has its first recipients," he announced proudly. On the screen behind him, photos showed 5 young people from diverse backgrounds who would begin their aviation careers thanks to the program inspired by that morning's events. Jenny, now the head of customer relations, led a workshop for new employees. The viral video of Dr. Thompson played on the screen, but it wasn't just about that one incident anymore. It was about building a culture of respect that would last. Starting today, Jenny told the group, "You're not just learning rules, you're becoming part of a legacy, the Thompson legacy." In schools across the country, teachers used Dr. Thompson's story in their lessons about character and courage. Children learned that sometimes the strongest response to hatred was calm dignity, and that one person's grace could change many hearts. The young boy Tommy's Heroes Among Us project had grown into a national school program. Students everywhere shared stories of people who faced discrimination with dignity, inspired by Dr. Thompson's example. Back at the hospital, Dr. Thompson finished her interview with the news crew. The reporter had one final question. "Did you know, in that moment, that your response would create such change?" Dr. Thompson thought for a moment before answering. "In medicine, we learn that healing isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about helping people grow stronger. That morning, our community had a wound. Instead of letting it become infected with anger, we helped it heal with understanding." As she drove home that evening, Dr. Thompson passed the private terminal. The setting sun caught the new plaque outside, making its words shine. "The Thompson Legacy, where respect meets excellence." Inside, Mitchell was ending his shift, teaching a new trainee about the importance of looking beyond appearances. That single morning had created ripples that continued to spread. In airports, schools, hospitals, and businesses across the country, people were learning that the best response to prejudice wasn't anger or shame. It was grace, dignity, and a commitment to positive change. Dr. Thompson parked her car and smiled, thinking of all the lives touched by that morning's events. Sometimes the most powerful medicine wasn't found in an operating room. Sometimes it was found in the moment when one person chose to turn darkness into light, hatred into understanding, and a difficult moment into a lasting legacy of change.